Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name is Savannah Horenque if you're new here, and if you're not, thank you for coming back. Today is Monday, October the 25th, and what better topic to talk about on a Monday than psychedelic mushrooms? I think that is a great way to get our week started here. Today, I am joined by UAB researcher and professor Dr. Peter Hendricks. Dr. Hendricks has spent years studying the effects of psychedelics and psilocybin, or psychedelic mushrooms, as many of us, or magic mushrooms, as a lot of us have heard them referred to. And Dr. Hendricks is actually part of and UAB, I should say, as a 3-school program that has gotten a pretty large grant to study the effects of psilocybin and these mushrooms on quitting smoking. So we have heard of the different uses for mushrooms over the past several years, especially, but I think this is a new one for a lot of us, Dr. Hendricks. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about that and a little bit about just psilocybin in general. I think this is a topic that a lot of people have questions about. I think we're going to get a lot of those here as well. So I appreciate you taking the time to explain this to us today.
Happy to be here, and I'm ready for all questions. Let's bring them on.
Well, first, I want to give a little bit of background about this grant you got coming. So this is a $4 million funding, and this is between UAB and yourself, the research you're going to do, NYU and Johns Hopkins. So these are some pretty powerful research institutions that you are going to be working with to do this research on using the whether you want to call it the mushrooms, the psilocybin. You can, I'm sure, give us the difference here in a minute, but using that to quit smoking. So that is an interesting use here that, again, I don't think a lot of us have probably heard of that use or are as familiar with that. So this is a pretty big deal. I also should note that this is the first federally funded study of classic psychedelics as a therapeutic in 50 years. I had to look down to make sure I got that right, but that's right. I mean, that's big news. 50 years, the federal government has not given money to a study like this. So I guess my first question to you is, number one, are you proud of that? I know that this is a big deal, and it kind of sounds funny in a way that you study psychedelics for a living, right? But it's a big deal.
Well, I would say that I study addiction treatments for a living, and I'm open to any novel treatment that might improve the success rates that we have now, which are not great. So I've said this before, but I'll say it again. If I gave 100 smokers the very best treatment money could buy right now, if 30 of those smokers actually quit smoking, I would have done a pretty good job. Right? So conversely, that means 70 of those smokers would have still been smoking. And I feel like those success rates are not acceptable. We need to do better. Now, I am in some ways fairly agnostic about what sort of intervention we use and how it works, right? So one could argue the existing data suggests that psilocybin could significantly boost those success rates. So this happens to be a psychedelic. There are associations with the counterculture. We all have ideas about the very salient subjective effects of psychedelics. And in some ways I could say, who cares? The only thing we should focus on is the outcome. Will people quit smoking? We think yes. Then this is something we should pursue further. I can certainly address some of the, socio-political associations, these ideas that people have about psychedelics and why they're stigmatized. But in the end, I would say we should be focused on the outcomes here. And if we can help people quit smoking, then we're going to save lives. And that's really what matters.
Now, I would imagine that something that you have heard before is that, look, if we use psychedelics, if we use mushrooms to sub for an addiction, whether that be a hard drug addiction, whether that be smoking, whether that be as therapy for some type of other mental disorder or mental disease, etc., if we're subbing these mushrooms for that treatment, aren't you just replacing an addiction to mushrooms versus the addiction that you're trying to treat? What would be your response to that?
That's a great question, and one that I've heard before. Well, so keep in mind that the average smoker might smoke between 10 and 20 cigarettes per day, every day. So there is a withdrawal process that keeps people returning to cigarettes. So the idea is you smoke a cigarette, you might feel okay for a period of time before you begin to feel bad. You have an urge to smoke again. You smoke, you feel better for a period of time before that process repeats. And that's why you continue to smoke cigarettes because you feel bad when you don't. There's a withdrawal process. For these interventions that involve psilocybin, we are administering the drug one time, maybe twice. In some studies, they've administered the drug as many as 3 times. But in most cases, we're talking about 1 or 2 administrations of the drug in an inpatient setting. And here's the thing about psilocybin. There is no known withdrawal syndrome. So people who use mushrooms tend to have no urges to do so again, right? So certainly you can abuse psilocybin, and people do. People abuse a lot of things. But are they addictive? There's no evidence that they are in fact addictive. There's no evidence that they produce withdrawal symptoms. Without withdrawal symptoms, you have no addiction. People don't report urges to use mushrooms. And we could all search far and wide for the rest of our lives, and we'd never encounter someone who'd tell us, I really wish I could stop using mushrooms or psilocybin, but I can't. I just have this urge and I can't resist it. In fact, many people, including our own participants, would say, that's not really an experience I'd care to repeat because it felt like a lot of work. It was intense. I felt like I resolved some issues or conquered some demons, but it's not something that I want to do. I mean, I often liken the experience that people have to Ebenezer Scrooge's experience on Christmas Eve. It can be, transcendent. It can be epiphanic, right? It can lead to epiphanies, but Ebenezer would not have wanted to have that experience every Christmas Eve. I think the idea is, I got the message. I don't need to do that again. It was rather intense, and I think once is enough. So there's no model in these interventions where we would be administering psilocybin more than 1 or 2 times. And I think even if we sent people home with a lifetime supply of psilocybin, the overwhelming majority would say, hey, no, thank you. I think once is enough.
Well, and that's interesting. And you make an interesting point here talking about people, and I'm sure some of the participants that you have studied throughout your career smoking, say, 10 to 20 cigarettes a day, or however many packs you want to call it, right? That is a decent amount of cigarettes, whichever way you look at it.
Oh, yeah.
Then you say, well, we want to give maybe 2 doses of psilocybin. How does that one experience, or even say those 2 experiences using that psychedelic medication, how does that really translate though to quitting smoking? What is the connection there?
So, I'm laughing because I would say that we don't really know. We don't entirely know, but we certainly have our hypotheses. And I think as best we know at the moment, here's what we think might be going on. So when you're dealing with an addiction, you have a rather intense focus on obtaining the drug and using the drug. You might say you're ruminating or fixating on it. You might even say you have something of a laser focus on obtaining the drug and using the drug. So if you haven't dealt with an addiction before, imagine how you might feel if you had fasted for 2 or 3 days, and then I took you to your favorite restaurant and ordered your favorite meal and put it there right in front of you. I'm guessing you'd have a hard time thinking about much of anything other than that food. And I think for people who are really strongly addicted, they feel too that though they would really like to stop and they realize that it's causing them problems in the long term, there's an intense focus and urge to use for the short-term benefits. When I say benefit, I mean relief of withdrawal syndrome or withdrawal symptoms. So I think for many people, addiction is ultimately characterized by this sort of laser focus, this myopic tunnel vision, where you are fixated on obtaining and using that drug. We think that with psilocybin, people have experiences in which their field of vision is quite literally expanded, right? Where they are suddenly in the presence of some sort of stimulus that's so large and so outside their understanding that their field of view has expanded, right? Their attention has now been focused on something so novel and so unlike anything else they've ever experienced that their focus, their fixation on, in this case, cigarettes, has suddenly just fallen by the wayside. They may have forgotten all about that, right? Because they're intensely focused on something else. I think also during these moments, people, because they've had this sort of broadening of awareness, they suddenly make some novel connections. They have insights that they hadn't had before. So it might be that when smoking, your thought is, this is bad for me. This is slowly killing me. This isn't good for me. But boy, I still have these urges to use. But often in these moments during the effects of psilocybin, people make some new connections, which might be, wait a second, not only is this bad for me, it's harming my relationships. It is going to impact my ability to be the best father or mother, brother or sister, grandparent, spouse that I can be. It's affecting the people around me who I really love. And I think if there's one thing that really motivates us, if there's one thing that I could say about, most humans is, we care a lot about the people we love. We want to be good to those we love. We want to be good family members. We want to be good spouses. We want to be good citizens. And we realize that our behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum, and what we do impacts those around us. And I think in the moment when people have these experiences with psilocybin, they're very acutely aware suddenly of how their behavior impacts those they love. And so much like Ebenezer Scrooge, when he realizes his stinginess has affected this employee of his and his employee's children, suddenly he's aware that his behavior does not exist in a vacuum. He finds some motivation to change once and for all. I think people have that sort of insight too, using psilocybin, and that is, hey, my behavior is impacting the people I love, and I need to change my behavior because I really care about my family and friends. So it's a little bit of, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say, is it fair to say then there's not necessarily a direct correlation between the psilocybins and quitting smoking? There's not a straight line there. It's the psilocybins and the realizations that are made during that experience that often encourage to quit smoking.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. So, and that's something that we're trying to understand a bit. So I could give, let's say, two people the same dose of psilocybin, and one person might have a very different experience than another. Why is that? Are there certain personality characteristics that predispose us to have experiences that might be especially therapeutic? Is it something about the relationship you have with your therapist? Is it something about the environment? Is it something about your mindset at the time? The answer would seem to be yes to all the above, but we're trying to understand that a bit better. I mean, we're really just at the very beginning of understanding these substances and how they work. And we recognize that ultimately what seems to be responsible for the effects of psilocybin are the subjective experiences that people have. And not everybody has the same type of experience. And of course, we want everyone to have an experience that leads to success. How exactly that happens, we don't know. And this research will allow us to understand that a bit better.
Well, and you say something that I want to expand on a little bit, and that is that this is a little bit subjective, right? People can have different experiences once they are using psilocybin or any type of psychedelic, really. People can have different experiences. There's probably not one exact way somebody would feel, right?
Yeah.
And I had a question, I've had several questions regarding this, including one here from John Paul, who says, what is the dosage like here? So would you say that you are going to give the same dosage to somebody who is either more addicted to cigarettes, smokes maybe more, versus somebody who smokes less, or versus the size of somebody? Maybe somebody that's 350 pounds versus somebody that's 150 pounds, male, female, age, etc. What is the dosage situation like? Or is there just one pathway you're taking right now and giving kind of a one size fits all look?
So we will typically dose based on weight. And that's what we plan on doing here. And we would administer 25 milligrams per 70 kilograms. So, what does that mean? Someone who weighs roughly 150 pounds would receive something in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 milligrams of psilocybin. Now, some very recent analyses out of Johns Hopkins would indicate that it really might be a more parsimonious approach to just administer the same dose to everyone. That you might get a slightly better response when you dose based on weight, but the sort of logistics that are involved in doing so may not necessarily be worth it. So I think this is a great question. Like, exactly, again, what predicts response? Does dose matter? How much does it matter? And should everyone receive the same dose? And I think right now the available evidence would suggest you probably get the best response when you dose according to weight, although the trouble in doing so may not really be worth it, and it might be a better approach to simply administer the same dose to everybody, But a bigger question is, again, what predicts response? Like, how do we predict who will have a response to psilocybin that's therapeutic, who will have a response that's maybe not especially notable, who might even have a response that is potentially not helpful, potentially makes matters a little more challenging down the road. We're trying to understand that as best we can. I think there are a lot of candidate moderators here, personality characteristics. It could have something to do with liver metabolism or brain activity. We don't know, but we're trying to get there so we can get to the point where we could say, Ivana, we know based on a number of characteristics that you would respond really well to psilocybin. Or we might say, hey, this may not be the best treatment for you based on the information we've gathered. Not only that, but we've also designed our intervention so that we get the most out of it, right? And what are those characteristics? How do we know that we get the most out of it? Again, we're only beginning to answer these questions now. I think at the moment, we just know it's really helpful to have a strong bond with the therapist and to be in an environment that you find safe and comforting.
Well, and you mentioned being in an environment you find safe and comforting, being with somebody you trust, etc. Is there a worry of giving somebody maybe too much and sending somebody down a Alice in Wonderland type rabbit hole that is not obviously, I would assume, what you're intending?
Well, we really do take great care to screen our participants. I mean, there would be some contraindications to psilocybin use. So somebody who has a personal or family history of psychosis or bipolar disorder would generally thought not to be a good candidate for psilocybin. It could hasten a psychotic break. Certainly, there are those who have serious underlying heart conditions where psilocybin could be a risk because this will increase your heart rate and blood pressure briefly, transiently during the period of acute drug action. And we do try to dose appropriately based on the available literature, right? So people have studied different doses and the effects of these doses. So the dose that we administer is thought to sort of maximize the therapeutic effects. And then we try to provide the safety that's needed, which would include a strong bond with the therapist and administration in a safe and supportive setting so that the very same therapist who'd be working with the participant preparing for the drug administration session would be there present with them to provide support in that moment. So far, we haven't had any evidence that anyone has been harmed. There have been no serious adverse events associated with psilocybin. But there are studies that have evaluated the use of psilocybin outside of these contexts in naturalistic contexts. There is some evidence that some people, a minority of people, have potentially been harmed. We certainly don't want that. And I think that's why we go through the steps that we go through to ensure everyone's safety. I think in this context, psilocybin is remarkably safe, but it's not safe in all circumstances. And that's why we approach this with caution, and we're very intentional about how we administer this so that we can avoid any of those adverse events that might occur.
What is the difference I understand this is in a controlled setting, this is prescribed, this is part of the study, or any of the other studies you do that are focusing on addiction. There's a point to this, is what I'm saying. This is not recreational. But take that aside. What is the difference technically than you, or we'll say I, doing this, taking this that you prescribe to me for this specific reason, but what is the difference in the product versus if I somehow were to find this just on the streets and either eat the mushrooms or make tea with the mushrooms, etc.? How is this different in the product wise than what you will be prescribing?
So we would administer psilocybin, pure psilocybin that has been synthesized by chemists according to good manufacturing practice. So it is just chemically isolated pure psilocybin and nothing but. And it's gone through a process to ensure that there's nothing there but psilocybin and nothing there that could potentially harm you. Right. So just like any other medication that you might be prescribed, you're getting exactly what you think you're getting and nothing else. In the case of mushrooms that contain psilocybin, and you'll see I did not say psilocybe because I don't want to be misheard there, but the genus of mushrooms are known as psilocybe mushrooms. So the difference there is, one, we can dose very precisely because we would have isolated psilocybin, we can administer exactly the amount that we want to administer. In the case of mushrooms, the psilocybin content for any given mushroom is going to vary depending on any number of conditions, the conditions in which the mushrooms grew, the substrate they grew on, environmental factors, which are probably countless. So any given mushroom is going to have a varying amount of psilocybin. So it would be difficult to dose precisely what you want to dose, right? There would be a fairly large window, and it would involve some guesswork.
That's interesting. That I could reach into a bag and either get a strong mushroom, I could get a really weak mushroom, I could get one that maybe isn't even really a mushroom. It's a weed somebody found in the yard and put in there. So that's interesting. You're saying essentially that what you're giving is pure. It is not something that there's guesswork in.
No guesswork, and it's not derived from a mushroom. Like, a chemist can look at the psilocybin molecule and essentially figure out a way to synthesize that in the lab without having to access mushrooms at any point. Now, ingesting a mushroom, like I said, involves a lot of guesswork. You're unsure as to the dose that you're receiving. And then there are going to be other things in that mushroom. There are going to be the proteins that make up the mushroom matter, chitin or chitin. I'm not exactly sure how it's pronounced. I've heard both. But it's not especially easy to digest. That's why we typically don't eat mushrooms raw, because they can cause indigestion. It's the same protein that most insects are made from, by the way. There would be other chemicals present in the mushroom that may or may not have an effect as well. We don't really understand that. And then, of course, if the mushroom's been picked, say, from a cow pasture, it probably has cow manure on it, if not, dirt and insects and other sorts of things. For most people who ingest psilocybe mushrooms, that doesn't bother them. They'd say that might be part of the appeal, that it's very organic. But I would say in one case, we're able to be very precise with our dose, and in the other, we can't be. And we're also, you're ingesting a protein that's hard to digest and that would cause some abdominal discomfort.
I have a couple of rapid fire questions I'm going to
Sure.
give you. This is one, and I don't know that anybody wants their name attached to these questions, so I'm not going to say names here. One, how long does this experience or this high last once you are given, in your setting, the pure psilocybin? I can't say
I wouldn't call it a high, by the way. So look, most drugs that are addictive will have some mechanism of action on dopamine receptors or the dopamine pathway. So people experience them as pleasurable. There's a euphoria or a high. People want to repeat the experience, and there are withdrawal symptoms that occur when the drug use has been stopped. In the case of psilocybin, certainly people report a certain sense of amazement or wonder at being at a spiritual height, but it's not the same sort of feeling. It's not a euphoric feeling, and it's experienced as hard work. So what's a good analogy here? Has anyone ever run a marathon before or gone to the gym and worked out really, really hard? They might say that there was something about that felt great, maybe especially after they felt wonderful. But was it easy running that marathon, or was it easy going to the gym and working out so hard that you wanted to vomit? You'd say no. And I think psilocybin is very similar. To answer the question, it's 4 to 6 hours.
4 to 6 hours. You mentioned inpatient earlier. Is this done in a hospital setting? Is this done in a therapy room where it's you and the therapist? What is the logistic on that?
Well, we would specifically administer in the clinical research unit at UAB, which is in Jefferson Tower, the oldest building on campus, or one of the oldest. And so it's in an outpatient hospital research ward. So you'd be in a hospital room that we've tried to decorate so that it's as comfortable as possible and doesn't necessarily make you feel like you're in a hospital. At the same time, there would be nurses just outside the door in case there was any sort of medical emergency. We don't anticipate there will be, but we like to go out of our way to ensure our participants' safety. And 2 therapists would be present in the room with the participants. So there'd be 2 therapists in the room and nurses just outside the door with a physician on call if needed.
Another question here is, why has it taken us so long, and I'm assuming us is meaning the nation or even the world, why has it taken us so long to get to this point where we are looking at psychedelics and psilocybin as a treatment and not something that is so maybe taboo or something that could carry serious criminal penalties as it has before?
Well, I mean, I'd say first of all, and like I'd really emphasize this, it doesn't make sense to criminalize the possession of any drug for personal use. Right? So you can imagine if you had a loved one who told you, I'm really struggling with opioids, I think I'm addicted, I'm using heroin. I'm sure your first response would not be, let me call the police and have you arrested. Right? You would recognize that that would not do them any good. They need treatment, and they're already dealing with an addiction. It doesn't help to also now give them, legal problems that only make the matter worse. So that aside, in the 50s and for most of the 60s, psilocybin and related compounds, namely LSD, were viewed as very legitimate medicines that were being explored by the medical field, by psychiatry. There was nothing sensational about them at all. But they eventually came to be associated with the countercultural revolution of the late 60s. And, I think that was probably a very tumultuous time and maybe a frightening time for some politicians. And I think the thought was that psychedelics, that LSD in particular, was fueling that countercultural revolution. And I think for someone like President Nixon, there was probably a concern that if he didn't act, that he'd have an entire generation refusing to go to Vietnam, an entire generation signing out of capitalism altogether to live on communes, and that we'd see a sort of disintegration of society. So the response was to place psilocybin and related compounds like LSD in Schedule 1, which meant, all right, these are dangerous and addictive and they have no medical application. And I think for the scientists at the time, this was a bit disappointing because there are a number of drugs of potential abuse that still have a medical application, right? So cocaine is not a Schedule 1 controlled substance. It is used as a local anesthetic. We use benzodiazepines to treat anxiety. We use stimulants to treat ADHD. And obviously we use opioids, not always appropriately, but we use opioids to treat pain. We realize that there are drugs that can be abused and could even be addictive, but still, if used appropriately, can be therapeutic. So it was unusual to say, we're going to make this blanket statement with psychedelics, even though they've found their way into the popular culture and they're potentially being abused. We're not going to acknowledge that they also might have a medical application. I think that was puzzling to many scientists at the time, but there's nothing really they could do other than to say, well, that's disappointing and move on. I think the facts are stubborn things, and the truth has a way of rising to the surface. And no matter the political attempt to sort of bury psychedelics once and for all, the fact remains that they could have a place in medicine. And I would say we're back to doing this once more because we realize that our existing treatments for a range of mental health conditions are not especially good. And people who are out there struggling deserve better. And we shouldn't overlook a class of substances like psychedelics only because they were associated with a sort of hippie counterculture in the past, and their use by the media was sensationalized, and it certainly was. And I often say this, and I realize I'm long-winded, but if the media chose to report on, say, every alcohol-related death or every tobacco-related death, that's all you'd ever do, right? Because 500,000 people die from tobacco every year. Almost 100,000 people die from alcohol every year. And these two drugs are not only legal, they're commercialized and widely available. They're dangerous. These are public health dangers. Two of the most significant risks or dangers to the public health are tobacco and alcohol. Certainly things can go wrong with psychedelics, and they do, but very rarely, and only a fraction of the time, they do with alcohol and tobacco. I think we have that sort of history of sensationalized media coverage that we're also running up against. But I think it helps for those of us who are doing this work now to say, look, we're only interested in exploring this as a potential treatment in a very carefully controlled medical setting. We're not advocating that anybody go out there and use. In fact, I frequently advocate that people do not do so. And if psilocybin proves to be an effective treatment for smoking cessation, wonderful, we can save lives. And if not, we'll let the data do the speaking and move on.
Could psilocybin psychedelics be used to treat a fentanyl addiction?
I think so. I think there's this thought that they could have what we call transdiagnostic application. So if most mental health conditions are characterized by this sort of intense focus, rumination, or fixation on one thing, where you have that sort of tunnel vision, an experience that broadens your awareness could be beneficial for a range of mental health conditions. So I would say, yes, it could be. No one's explored that yet, but people will be.
Well, and again, I know that your specialty here is in addiction, so maybe maybe one of these days you'll have some more answers for us on that one. Another quick, again, rapid fire question here: how is this taken? Is it taken in a capsule form, a tea, etc.?
Capsule.
And is this just something that, again, is created in the lab once they extract that chemical?
That's right.
And a lot of comments, a lot of questions about, and this might be something that we have to talk about in the future because this is probably a loaded question. There is a lot of comments about, look, why can't people just smoke pot and be able to have the same effects of quitting smoking or for other addictions? Why can't we just do this with pot? Wouldn't that be easier?
Oh, yeah. Well, so look, there is some data to suggest that people will use cannabis as a substitution. I've published on that myself. I think, that's a growing area of research, that some people will substitute cannabis for more harmful drugs. The question is, why can't we? Well, Alabama is one of a handful of states that doesn't really have a medical cannabis program. I realized that there was something that Governor Ivey signed recently, though
that will
really
hopefully be in effect by the fall of 2022. Farms are allowed to start growing that for medical marijuana purposes. It's a very limited use. There are
right.
A list of disorders that it can be used for. I can put some of that information here in the comments, though I don't have it in front of me. But there's about 12 to 15.
The plant itself will remain illegal. So these will all be sort of medical extracts. You would not be allowed to purchase and smoke the plant, for instance.
Correct.
The question is, the larger question is, why can't we? Why do we criminalize the possession of drugs for personal use? A lot of that can be traced to the war on drugs, which has been very costly and hasn't seemed to have accomplished its objectives. Look, maybe cannabis could be useful in this regard. I think it's worth studying. I realize we're kind of veering off onto another topic, but I also do think that some people can develop an addiction to cannabis that could be harmful. So anytime we make legal changes to a drug like cannabis, we have to consider that there are pros and cons to this, and maybe that's for another day.
Look, what is your hope to get out of this study?
The hope is anytime we test any kind of novel intervention, anytime we test a new treatment, that we'll see evidence that it helps a lot of people quit smoking. I think it's nice that I'm able to sort of talk about this in the backdrop of the development of, let's say, COVID vaccines. Anybody who developed any one of these companies that developed the vaccine would have hoped that their vaccine was very effective. I would say that our hope too is that psilocybin will show that it's effective, and that if that's the case, safe and effective, that we would have another option for people who'd like to stop smoking, and that we can save lives. That's the objective. But we have to let the data do the talking. If it is not in fact effective, then we'll move on and see if something else might work.
When do we expect to get some data, some results from this study? About how long do you think the study is going to last?
I think 2024 or 5 we'll have some results. Probably 2025.
Well, I will be I know everybody is going to be eagerly awaiting some more information on this. Very interesting stuff coming out of your office and out of UAB and of this grant in general, Dr. Hendricks. So thank you so much for being able to break this down for us and kind of take away that stigma of when you just hear psychedelics, being able to explain, look, this is why, and it's not maybe as out there as it sounds at first here.
No, not at all. It's very simple. Can we help people quit smoking? Yes or no?
Well, and I know that your hope there is yes, Dr. Hendricks. So thank you so much for your time. Everybody, thank you so much for all of your questions. We're going to leave a link here to that study that we had published, or that story, I should say, that we published last week on this exact grant and some more details there. And again, Doctor, thank you so much for all of your information here. Everybody watching, we'll see you tomorrow.